The story of the birth of the Rebbe Rashab, the life of the Rebbe Rashab, begins with a dream. The Rebbe Marash was the youngest of 7 sons. The Tzemach Tzedek had 9 children, as did the Mittler Rebbe. The difference is that the Mittler Rebbe had 7 daughters and 2 sons. Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons and 2 daughters. The Rebbe Marash, who was the youngest of the children, for whatever reasons, ended up living in the same house as his father, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek wanted his kids to live in Lubavitch. They should stay in Lubavitch. So when each one of them got married, he built them a house in Lubavitch, on one of the streets of Lubavitch. Tzemach Tzedek built for his sons a house, and a shul. And they lived in this house, and next to the house was their shul. So the Seder in Lubavitch in those days was that when a chassid came to the Tzemach Tzedek, to the Rebbe, he also had his favorite son. You understand? There were 6 of them. One of them had moved away, but or 5 of them. They lived in Lubavitch. So every chassid would go to the Rebbe, and he also had his favorite son. This one would go to the Ravash, this one would go to the Maharil, this one would go to the Marin, this one would go to the Machshas, this one would go to... There was a son named Rabbi Yankiv, who didn't really live in Lubavitch. There was the Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, after whom the Frierdiker Rebbe was named, and then the youngest was, quote, Reb Shmuel, the youngest, Reb Marash. All of them had their homes built on one of the streets of Lubavitch with a shul next to it, and that's how they lived. When the Reb Marash was married twice. He got married the first time, his father also did the same thing. He bought him a house and built him a house in a shul. His Rebbetzin passed away 3 months after the chasna. She died right away. And the Reb Marash was so broken that he was pushed unconsolable. He could not. He was so upset that he lost his first wife. He couldn't calm down. They were married for a very short time. So the Tzemach Tzedek Pashat needed to be menachem. So he built an extension to his own house, and he moved the Reb Marash into the house. In other words, there was 2 apartments in a building, Tzemach Tzedek's house, and they made a door, and there was a few more rooms, which is the Rebbe Marash lived. The Marash got married the second time 2 years later in Tafrei Shud. That would be 1850. But after he got married, he continued living in his father's house. He never moved to the other house with the shul on another street, which is why his children, who were by far the youngest grandchildren, the Marash was younger than many of his nephews and nieces. The Marash was younger than many. When he was born, he probably had a dozen or 2 nephews and nieces. They were all older than him. He was mamish a real ben zekunim. But because he lived in the same house with his father, his children, who were the youngest, Einiklach, in a weird kind of way, ended up with the closest relationship to the Zayda, to the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, especially at the end of his life when he was ill. And this is the story of the Rebbe Rashab's birth. The Rebbe Rivka, who was the Tzemach Tzedek's, he was the Marash's first cousin, right? Their mothers were sisters. Rebbe Rivka's mother was Sarah. The Marash's mother was Achei Temimim. They were sisters. They were both daughters of the Mittler Rebbe. The Sarah was the youngest of the daughters, and the Rebbe Achei Temimim, I'm going to guess, was the oldest, although it's hard to know for sure. She was one of the oldest of the Mittler Rebbe's children, and their children got married, first cousins. By the Rebbe's Mishpachas, this is done a lot. She was a Yesema, she had no parents, and the Rebbe's in Shendel, the Mittler Rebbe's wife, made a shidduch. It's a whole story which is not negated to us. But the Rebbe Rivka married the Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Marash, she told the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe Marash was not just her husband, but he was her teacher. Since she didn't grow up in a regular, she didn't have a normal life. Her parents died when she was a child. The Rebbe Marash would teach her how to do things, teach her how to mother, teach her how to look after children. They did everything together. The Shalom Bayis in that house, it was wonderful. The great Rebbe Marash, when the kids were being raised, he was so there to help his wife figure it out. That's the impression that you get. She was a big tzidkonis, and she's the one who passed away on Yud Shvat, that the Tzemach Tzedek had to tell her better to eat for davening than to davening for eating, as you all know the story. That's the Rebbe Rivka. So she had a dream. It was Yud Kislev Tafrei Chaf, 1859. And in her dream, she saw, I think 5 or 7 men whom she did not recognize. And one of them told her to write a Sefer Torah. Now, if you write a Sefer Torah, you'll have a special son. And then another one said to her, you should do what your Zayda is telling you. And then they gave her a bracha, and she woke up. She didn't know anything with the dream. We know who the people were, I just don't remember offhand. I have my notes, but I had to look it up. I didn't look it up. This Kislev had the same dream, but she saw 2 more people. Instead of 5, she saw 7. And again, one of them said to her, write a Sefer Torah, v'es to have my special and have a special son. And another one said, the folk, listen to what your grandfather is telling you. You should write a Sefer Torah. And then they gave her a bracha.
Which representative?
Representative. And she said, Amen. But the Amen, she said that she was waking up. So the Amen came out loud. You could hear the Amen. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Her husband, Rebbe Marash, was getting up to start his day. He wasn't a man of much sleep, but he'd been sleeping. He got up, and he's about to leave the bedroom, and he hears his wife say, Amen. Mitten schlaf, middle of sleeping. So he turns around, and he sees that she's awake. And he says, what just happened? She says, nothing. He says, no, it wasn't nothing. So he managed to get out of her the dream. And the Rebbe Marash told his wife, such things you cannot keep secret, because they could be dvarim ha'oimdim berume shalalim. You can't imagine how important such things may actually be. And 2 o'clock in the morning, he ran through the door from his apartment into the Tzemach Tzedek's apartment, and he went into his father. And he told his father about the dream, and Tzemach Tzedek called her, the Rebbe Rivka, to come herself. I can just imagine how she had to wash negavas, and she had to prepare. She was a tzedkanis, she was very frum and very tzniistic, how she had to get dressed. And it probably took her some time, and she came into the shver. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. And the Tzemach Tzedek asked her to describe the people that she saw in her dream, which she did. Tzemach Tzedek told her who she saw. She saw the Alter Rebbe and the Middle Rebbe and some of the Alter Chassidim. I'm sorry, I didn't look up the story fresh, so I don't remember the names, but it says exactly who they were. And in the second dream, there were a couple of more. So I'm not going to guess, but the for sure was Alter Rebbe and the Middle Rebbe. And Tzemach Tzedek told her, you have to do it. So the Rebbe Marash turns to his father and says, okay, let's make a big party. We'll make a haschala. We'll get a sefer, we'll start writing a Sefer Torah, and we'll make a big party out of it. And Tzemach Tzedek said, no, absolutely nicht. You'll bring the sefer into my room with a yeriyah, with a piece of parchment, and he'll write the word Bereshis. Tzemach Tzedek filled in the base of Bereshis, I believe. And no one is allowed to know about it. No one's allowed to know about it. Okay, the Tata Gehesen, the father says, your father listens, right? Just like you listen to your father. The Rebbe Marash listened to his father without an argument. So they hired a sefer to write the Sefer Torah. The Rebbe Tzedek got pregnant. She became with child, as they say in English. And she began to sew a mantele for she bought the material and she made for herself. She did it. She made the shirt for the Sefer Torah. She made herself. To write a Sefer Torah takes a little bit less than a year, so you have to figure sometime in the summer the Sefer was finishing the Sefer Torah. And then Rebbe Marash says to his father, now we'll make a big party. We'll make a big siyum. We'll invite people. There'll be Chassidus. There'll be a fabrengen. Someone says, no. I'll tell you when the siyum is going to be, and no one is going to be there. Once in Pashat the Mitternacht, he called the Rebbe Marash and says, get the Sefer, we're finishing the Sefer Torah now. So who was there? The Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Sefer, and the Mishoras of the Tzemach Tzedek. There was nobody present. They finished the Sefer Torah.
What day?
We don't know. As far as I know, we don't know. It was sometime in the summer. Then you have to make a Hachnasa Sefer Torah. So the the servant carried the poles of the chuppah. Tzemach Tzedek carried the Sefer Torah, and the Rebbe Marash carried the candles. And they walked through the deserted streets of Lubavitch, I'm assuming to the shul. They went into the shul, they put the Sefer Torah into an Kodesh, and that was the whole siyum. Still. Lubavitch had a shikir, had a drunk, who was sleeping on the side of the road. And he wakes up and he sees the Rebbe walking, holding a Sefer Torah. Imagine you wake up in the middle of the night, quiet! And the Rebbe is holding a Sefer Torah, and the Rebbe's son is holding candles, and the Mishar is holding a chuppah. He freaked out. He wasn't sure if he was awake or not. Anyway, the next morning, he came into the shul, and he told people what he saw during the night, and the Chevra said, you know what, it's time for you to stop drinking, because you're becoming delusional. You're developing an imagination. But it actually happened. He saw it. He witnessed it. This is the Metzias Advarim. Everything around the Rebbe Rashab, the Tzemach Tzedek went out of his way to keep it secret. That's the whole story. The Rebbe Rashab was born Chav Cheshvan in Tafresh Chaf Aleph. It was still 1860. The Hebrew year was already 5621 Tafresh Chaf Aleph, but the English year was still 1860. So the baby was born Chav Cheshvan to the Levites, the bris, lyhadus, supposed to be Chav Zayin Cheshvan. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek cannot tell his son not to make a bris, you know what I'm saying? So they got a moil, and they prepared a bris. But when you have a bris in the house of a Rebbe, hundreds of Chassidim would come to participate, maybe thousands. So you had to feed them all. So there was a big kitchen in the Rebbe's house, and the Rebbetzins and the daughters and the granddaughters would cook food to feed all the Chassidim. In other words, they didn't have a catering service. The catering service were the wives of the Beis Rivka, the Rebbetzins. At that time, the senior matriarch was Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, Tzemach Tzedek's wife, who would pass away 2 months later. That year, she passed away in Tevis. This is Cheshvan. And she was the senior matriarch. She was in charge. And she's running the kitchen. Now you have to understand something. The Tzemach Tzedek's relationship with his wife was a very interesting one. It was very interesting. They had a lot of respect for each other. But the Middle Rebbe's daughters were extremely outspoken. The Middle Rebbe's daughters were strong women with strong opinions. And the Rebbetzin Musya was the same way. There's stories about how she argued with her husband more than once or twice. Very strong characters. I mean, there's a lot of stories that we know. They were powerful ladies. There were 7 of them. They were powerhouses. So the Tzemach Tzedek and his wife would often get into arguments. And when they get into arguments, he would stand his ground and she would stand her ground. So sometimes he would win, sometimes she would win. But if she really wanted to win an argument, she had to say, I'm saying this as the daughter of a Talmud Chacham. Bas Talmud Chacham. If she said Bas Talmud Chacham, Tzemach Tzedek backed down because he wasn't going to argue with that. She was the Middle Rebbe's daughter. You know that the Friedrich Rebbe told our Rebbe, it's in the Rishimis, it's printed. The Friedrich Rebbe told our Rebbe that Tzemach Tzedek was very great, but he wasn't the Middle Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe says that. The Middle Rebbe apparently was greater than the Alter Rebbe. Apparently. We have no idea. The Friedrich Rebbe talks about the Middle Rebbe, it's in print. Like as if he's higher than other Rebbeim, mamish. So if she said Bas Talmud Chacham, she won the argument. Anyway, at 5 o'clock in the morning, there's a house full of people, all up, a bunch of women, they're cooking. And the Rebbe walks out of his room, Tzemach Tzedek does, and he sees the Veila Leah. The Veila Leah was the Rebbe Rashab's older sister. She couldn't have been more than 4 or 5. Maybe 6. Maybe 7. She was the oldest. Rebbe Rashab had 6 kids. The oldest was a girl, the youngest was a girl, in between was 4 boys. The Rebbe Rashab was probably the 3rd boy or the 2nd boy. It's a little bit unclear. But she was for sure the oldest. She was a little maidel, but she was grown up, and she was old enough to make her way around. Tzemach Tzedek calls her, 1 second, and he says to the Veila Leah, go tell your father that the bris is not happening today. Go tell your father the bris is not today. She walks away from the Zayda. Who bumps into her? Rebbetzin Musya. Now she knew that her husband was liable to pull off some kind of stunts. So when she sees that her husband is speaking to little girls and sending them messages, she gets in the girl's way and says, Vu gehst du? Where are you going? Ich gehe zum Taten. Going to my father. Why are you going to the Tate? Well, the Zayda had gesagt, das Heint wird nicht sein the bris. The Zayda said that today is not going to be the bris. So she says, geh zum Zayda und ich habe gesagt, das wird ja sein the bris. We didn't cook all this food for nothing. Go tell your Zayda, the bris is going to be today. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, because you said that, the first Rebbe said that Tzemach Tzedek was great, but not as good as Rebbe.
As great. It's very unusual for him to say that, yeah.
Tzemach Tzedek was raised, Alter Rebbe also raised Tzemach Tzedek.
You're asking Kashis. Asking Kashis.
I just, yeah. He was like, he wasn't, like...
I probably shouldn't have even said it.
No, I'm just like...
So I can explain it. How am I supposed to explain such things? It's neshamas. This is not about your education. Yeah. For me and you, it's maybe an education. For a Rebbe, it's a neshama. It's a neshamas. It's neshamas. Leave it alone. Please, leave it alone. Don't try to understand it. You'll never understand these things.
And about just said now, like the Alter Rebbe raised the Mitra Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek not at the same time.
The Middle Rebbe was the Tzemach Tzedek's father-in-law.
Right.
So what do you think? They raised him at the same time?
No, he was more or less brother.
That's correct.
Like what's the age difference? I'm just curious.
Between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Middle Rebbe? 16 years. 16 years. Less than 16 years, a little bit. He was his father-in-law, 16 years older than him, Lishmer. Okay. That's how they got married very young. And it worked out. They had Shalom Bayis somehow. Anyway, So the girl goes back to the Zayde and says to the Zayde, the Baba gesagt hat, Heinz wird ja sein, der Bris. So the Tzemach Tzedek doesn't argue, goes back to his room, waits a couple of hours, comes back again, summons the same Develele and says, listen, go tell your father, the Bris is not today. The Rebbe's Achei Mushka's antennae were already up, you understand? She catches the little girl again. It happened 3 times, it happened a few times. So finally she says to her husband, today's the Bris. Bas Talmud Chacham you can argue with, right? So, okay, done. So they make the bris. Kvate! They bring the baby out. And you could assume that the baby was checked before by the moil. The Rebbe Achei Mushka was very old. She passed away 2 months later. She was in good health, but she was not young. She was at that point in her 70s for sure. In her 70s for sure, yeah. And she hears a commotion. She didn't understand the commotion. What was the commotion? They took the baby to the bris, and the baby was so jaundiced, it was so yellow, there was no way they were making the bris. So the bris was delayed. But this can't blame Tzemach Tzedek, it's medicine, yeah? 15 minutes before the baby was beautiful, pink, yeah? Mitamol, the baby's jaundiced. So she hears noise, and she doesn't understand what's going on. So she says to the other ladies, what's going on? So they finally figured it out. You can't make the bris today. And she got so upset. Kunst von Taten. She knew that the Tzemach Tzedek pulled this off. He didn't use magic marker, you understand? He did what he had to do. The Rebbe Achei Mushka was so accustomed to miracles. Her Zayde was a Rebbe, her father was a Rebbe, her husband was a Rebbe, all of her sons were Rebbes. She was surrounded by tzaddikim. So she didn't get excited about a mess. She's one of the people that used to say that miracles are rolling around on the floor and no one had time to pick them up. So when the Tzemach Tzedek would do a miracle, she called it a kunz, a magic trick. Big deal, a kunz. So she got really upset. She didn't like it because she invoked Bas Talmud Chacham. That was her greatest ticket. Tzemach Tzedek said, "This is medicine, doctor. I can't listen to the doctor. He made the arrangements." So the bris wasn't. No bris. And the Tzemach Tzedek made a fabrengen, and he said, "Chassidus, older Chassidus, made and drank, but there was no bris." And the Rebbe says, Marash says to his father, when's going to be the bris? I'll tell you when's going to be the bris. One day Chanukah, out of the blue, he calls it Tzemach Tzedek, the Marash, the bris is now. So the Rebbe Marash says, okay, I'll go get a minion. He says, no minion, a moil and me and you, and that's it. So the Marash says, can I call my brothers? No. Can I call one of my brothers, Baril? Oichet nicht. It's just interesting. Everything around the Rebbe Rashab was so this. Oh, big secret. So it was the middle of Chanukah, and the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, was the Sandik, and he gave him the name. The Tzemach Tzedek Bechlal gave names to all of his children and grandchildren. You probably know this. That the Rebbe did not like to give names to people. People used to ask the Rebbe to choose a name for the children, and the Rebbe wouldn't give. Bechlal, he would say no. He would say that it says in Kisvei Arizal that parents are granted a nevuah to give children a name, and nobody else should mix in. The Rebbe always said to parents, you choose the name. There were occasions where the Rebbe chose the name, but the Tzemach Tzedek used to give names to all of his children and grandchildren. I'm sure you know this, that when the Rebbe Achei Mushka was born, the Rebbe Rashab wrote a letter to the Frierdiker. She wasn't born in Lubavitch. She was born outside Lubavitch, Babanovich, I think. And the Rebbe Rashab wrote to the Frierdiker, Rebbe, if you haven't named her yet, name her Achei Mushka after the wife of the Tzemach Tzedek. Yeah. And then many, many years later, the Rebbe's father would write to the Rebbe, that you and your wife have the names of the Tzemach Tzedek and his wife, the Rebbe Rashab. But he uses the word chaver, partner, friend, the Rebbe Leivik.
Who's by the bris?
The moyo, the grandfather and the father. As far as I know, that's it.
Do you know who the mother was?
Yeah. I forgot his name at the moment. I'll tell you later. How am I supposed to know what the moyo was?
Maybe it says.
And maybe it says, but if it says, it'll make a difference.
Was Rebbe Tzedek?
The Rebbe Tzedek? I would imagine, but I don't know. But there was no people. He didn't want anybody to know what was going on around this little child. So the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, was the Sandik, and then he gave the name. And he gave the name Sholem Dev Ber. Sholem is the Tzemach Tzedek's father. Tzemach Tzedek's father's name was Sholem Shachne, same Sholem. And Deber was the Rebbe Achei Mushke's father, the middle Rebbe. So Sholem Deber was half of the Tzemach Tzedek's father's name, and the other half was the Rebbe Achei Mushke's father, the middle Rebbe. And he wasn't the only Sholem Deber, by the way. The other Sholem Debers, the Tzemach Tzedek had other Einiklach, whom he had named Sholem Deber. But the Tzemach Tzedek had a minig that when he named each one of his children and his grandchildren, he would also give them an abbreviation, a nickname. Like the Rebbe, our Rebbe, before he was Rebbe, we used to call him the Ramash. I wasn't born yet, the Ramash. Because you were not allowed to say the name of a member of the Rebbe's family. So the Tzemach Tzedek gave each one of his children and grandchildren a name and a nickname. And when they were infants, it was considered chutzpahdik to say the name of one of the Tzemach Tzedek's family members. It was a big chassid who once said to the Rebbe Rashab when he was a bacher, Shalom Ber. Called my name, Shalom Ber. The Marash opened the window and he said, Ich will sehen, welcher chutzpahdik neruft tzartzke v'shpocha bam namen. I want to see which chutzpahdik has the nerve to call royalty by its name. You were not allowed to say the names of the Rebbe's children when they were 2. Just the nickname. So he gave him the name Shalom Deber, and he immediately added Rashab. Rashab. And he translated Basar Shever. Basar means flesh, the flesh, Gashmias, Shever, to break. It's the same oisius. Rashab is 3 oisius, Basar is 3 oisius, Beis Shin Reish, and then Shever is also Shin Beis Reish, Basar Shever. And the Rebbe many times, verbringt on Chof Cheshvan, in my years in yeshiva, and he spoke about the Rebbe Marash's name, the Rebbe Rashab's name, and he spoke about the fact that his name was Deber, which means a bear. And a bear is Mesurbal Babasa, there's a lot of meat. And the Rebbe explained that the Indian of the Rebbe Rashab is to be mavader, to bring correction to Gashmias. And it's consistent with the name, the nickname that Tzemach Tzedek had given him by his bris, Basar Sheva. The Rebbe Rashab was, like I said, he was either the 3rd or the 4th in his family. Probably the 4th, but there's some problems with the documents. He had a brother, the Bevram said that I do not know if he was younger or older, and it's hard to know for sure. What can I tell you? So but he certainly had an older brother or sister. You know, there were different kinds of Rabbeim. When the Rabbeim were children, there were different types. L'mashal, the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, when he was a child, played. The Rebbe Marash, when he was a child, got into trouble. He once lowered a friend of his down into the well and walked off. There were different kinds of Rebbes in their childhood. Some of the Rabbeim were never children. The Rebbe Rashab had an earnestness about him which was pashat, frightening, shreklach. In other words, if you had a child who acted like the Rebbe Rashab, you would have thought that he had some kind of mental illness. He was so serious. As a 2-year-old, the earnestness was very incredible. Our Rebbe was the same way. Our Rebbe was so earnest as a child. He never played. He played just so he should look like he's playing. He should be considered one of the kids. You understand? But he never played. It was an ernestkeit. But the Rebbe Rashab, the same thing. An earnestness that was extraordinary. And he was extremely, extremely frum. And his older brother and sister figured this out quickly, and they took full advantage. He was free service. You know, whenever they needed something, they would send their younger brother to fetch it, and he was Mekayim Kibbud Avei, right? Everybody knows that Kibbud Avei means your older brother and your older sister. Mistama means your older brother, but she took advantage also, and the Rebbe Rashab was always doing whatever they said. Whatever they said, he did. Got as a enskeit about him. It was pushed his tchunas hanefesh, his character had an earnestness that was even for the Rabbeim unusual. The other thing about the Rebbe Rashab, which I'll probably talk about later more, in addition to his earnestness, was his precious. The Rebbe Rashab was really removed from the world. He was almost like the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe had no shaykhs to the world. The Mittler Rebbe didn't know the value of money. Imagine the guy was so brilliant, so smart. He couldn't understand what's the difference between a 1 ruble note and a 10 ruble note. It's a piece of paper. He couldn't get the value of money. It just didn't work for him. The Rebbe Rashab was similar. He was a big porush. He was removed from the world. I mean, as a Rebbe, he couldn't speak Russian. He was born in Russia, raised in Russia, didn't speak Yiddish. He didn't speak Russian. He was a mamish porush. And sort of to give you a sense of it, some of the Rabbeim, I mean, all the Rabbeim are tzaddikim. We're talking about a Rebbe and a Shama close. Some of the Rabbeim were very cosmopolitan. They knew everything. You know, they knew about the world. They knew everything. I mean, there's no greater example of a cosmopolitan Rebbe than our Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe was that way. The Rebbe Marash was that way. The Alter Rebbe was that way. But the Mittel Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe Rashab, I don't know. Every Rebbe has his job. They do what they have to do. Some of the Rebbeim were extremely broad. Some of them were very. The Rebbe Rashab was not. He was very in the box. He did what he was a tzaddik, served Hashem, and there was no world as far as he was concerned. And his older brother and sister were taking advantage of his frumkeit. But it was so much fun to have this little kid who was happy to serve you because Makayim mitzvah the Eibishter, that they would sometimes take it a step farther and they would make fun of him. And they would tease him that he's so stupid, he's so gullible, he's so naive. He was being Makayim a mitzvah. And to him, what's more important than a mitzvah? The Eibishter geisen. Hashem said, put on film, you put on film. Hashem said, honor your parents, you honor your parents. Hashem said, your older brother and sister deserve honor like your father and your mother. So he was doing a mitzvah, he did a b'simcha rabbah, and they would make fun of him that he's such a, what's the word? He has no backbone. Whatever they tell him, he was doing it because he was serving the Eibishter, you know. So when they would tease him, he would cry. But he would never answer back. Why? This was the Rebbe Rashab. There was an earnestness about him that was mamish. It was unusual. Now, I mentioned to you before that they lived in the same house. They lived in the same house with the Tzemach Tzedek. Even though the Rebbe Marash was the youngest of the children, but because of the fact that the Rebbe Marash had been married twice, they lived in the same house. He was very close to the Tzemach Tzedek. And there's some little stories, little anecdotes about the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab. Some of them are little, some of them are big, some of them are gigantic. But they're all part of the Rebbe Rashab's childhood. When the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, the Rebbe Rashab was 5.5. And the Rebbe Rashab would say as a Rebbe, loud and emphatically, I remember the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek was his grandfather. He even though he was 5.5 or so when the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic, he would say proudly, I remember the Tzemach Tzedek. And there's little stories. The most famous of the stories are the one who's Nayem Yem tomorrow. That when he was 4 or 5 years old, the minig in those days was that every one of the Tzemach Tzedek's children would go into the Zaydah for their birthday. You know, the Tzemach Tzedek was a really, really involved grandfather. He had a lot of children and a lot of grandchildren. Every single week he tested every single one. Every single week he tested every anicle. I don't know if that continued until the very end of his life, but that was his say, that he was very involved with his children and his grandchildren. So they would go in for the lyhadus. So when the Rebbe Rashab was either 4 or 5, his birthday was Pashas Vayera, or near Pashas Vayera, as it always is. So you all know this. He went into his grandfather and he cried. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, "Was weinst du? Why are you crying?" So he said, "Ich wein, ich gelernt in Chumash." I learned in Chumash or in Cheder. I don't know if he was learning Chumash from inside or the Malamed was telling stories. That Hashem revealed himself to Avraham Avinu. And I want to know why Hashem revealed himself to Avraham Avinu und zu mir anplekt sich nicht. He doesn't reveal himself to me. This was the Rebbe Rashab was crying. So the Tzemach Tzedek answered him famously, as a Yid Tzaddik, so 99 Jahre, is machlet, as darf sich mal sein, is wert, as Eibishter soll sich beweisen. A Yid who's a Tzaddik makes a decision that he has to still do a bris, in other words, he can still make himself more perfect, he deserves that the Eibishter should reveal himself to him. And the Rebbe has siches on this episode, probably more siches on this episode than any other thing on the Likutei Sichos. It's very interesting. There's at least 3 siches, maybe 4, in the Likutei Sichos on this story. And the pshat is, when a person is 99, they're almost perfect. So you could say it's good enough to be 99 and say, I need to become more perfect. Is a vet, for that you deserve that the Eibishter should reveal yourself to. That's the mindset, that's the story. And of course, the Rebbe has a whole hero from the story, and especially from the fact that the story was revealed to us. This is one of the stories to Rebbe Rashab and the Tzemach Tzedek, his Zaydah. Another story is that he had an older brother. The Rebbe Rashab had an older brother. His name was Razor, Reb Zalman Aaron. And they lived in the house. So sometimes they would go into the Zaydah's room and play. They played around. I'm not sure how people felt about it, but they were little kids, you know. Anyway, one day they were in the room of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Tzemach Tzedek had a shtreimel that was sitting on the table. His own shtreimel. The Razor, who was a year and a half older, the Rebbe Rashab picked up his grandfather's shtreimel and put it on his head. He wanted to feel like a Rebbe, he's wearing a shtreimel. The Tzemach Tzedek walked over to his grandson, the Razah, took the shtreimel off his head, and put it on the Rebbe Rashab's head, who was the younger son, and probably would never put a shtreimel on his own head, because he was too earnest for that. And he pushed him away from his body, so he could look at him at arm's length, and he looked at the little boy with the shtreimel, and he said, Pung de Shver, exactly my father-in-law. I mean, the Mittler Rebbe. He looks exactly like my father-in-law. The Rebbe Rashab was 4, was a little boy. Pung de Shver, Tzemach Tzedek knew. Pung de Shver, exactly like the Mittler Rebbe. And there's a lot of truth to that. Another story which is very powerful, it's a pnimistic story, that once the Rebbe Rashab was in the Tzemach Tzedek's room, Tzemach Tzedek picked him up, put him on his lap. He took his grandson's hand and brushed it through his beard like this. He played with it. He used his fingers as a comb, as a brush. I don't know if you know this. The Rebbe used to brush his beard. We know that for a fact. But let's say the Rebbe Rashab, whose biography we're talking about, he never touched his beard. Never touched his beard. Because there's a Darizal right, you have to worry about a hair falling out. Never touched his beard. The Rebbe, some of the Rebbe were very particular, not to, mamish, forget about brushing, didn't touch the beard, you're afraid the hair would fall out. The Rebbe used to brush his beard. And you brush your beard, your hairs fall out, that's just how it is. Don't worry, the Rebbe's big enough tzaddik. Don't feel bad about it, you know what I'm saying? It's all good. It's all good, the Rebbe. Azar Rebbe came on the Geven, don't worry about it. But the Rebbe Rashab, not all the Rebbeim. So the Tzemach Tzedek probably didn't brush his beard much either, but he had his grandson brush through his beard, to separate the hairs, and he did it for a while. And then he said to the little boy, Tzebersht, Dachtzach Tzebersht. Did you take out all the tangles? Did you disentangle all the knots? All of it? Is it good? Is the beard good? Is everything separate? I think so. And then he said in Yiddish, Nadir ayad in Kabbalah. I'm giving you a hand in Kabbalah. Nadir ayad in Kabbalah. The whole thing was a pneumistic thing. I'm giving you a hand. When the Rebbe Rashab was a Rebbe, it's in Teda Shalom, he says loud, Icha bayad in Kabbalah. So the Rebbe Rashab said, I have a hand. I'm an expert on Kabbalah. Icha bayad in Kabbalah. And he was talking about this story. There's a little boy.
Who did what? The Rashab and Tzemach Tzedek.
The Tzemach Tzedek put him on his lap, took his hand, and brushed it through his beard. And the Rebbe Rashab didn't have a beard, he was 3. And he said to him, Tzebesh, did you separate all the hairs? I think so. Nadir ayad, and 30, 40 years later, the Rebbe Rashab would say it. It's a bit in Shalom. Icha bayad in Kabbalah. I have a hand in Kabbalah. Tzemach Tzedek gave my yad. What does this mean? You brush your beard, you become an expert in Kabbalah. It's not going to work for you, I promise. You're talking about Heichen Nishamas. But this is the story. The Bleivik, right, our Rebbe's father, was a Makubal Nifla. And people used to ask him, how you know so much Kabbalah? So he said that the Rebbe Rashab taught him Kabbalah. So they told him, if you add up all the hours that you spent in Lubavitch, it doesn't explain how come you know so much. So Rabbi Leivik said, Klolim. Matmerivi gave him Klolim. I was given rules about how to do Kabbalah. And it all goes back to this story. The Rabbi Leivik's Yad in Kabbalah goes back to this story that the Tzemach Tzedek gave the Rebbe Rashab a Yad in Kabbalah. Another story that we know, I'm sure there's a lot of stories that we don't know, is the Maisa with the candies. You know what with the candies? That the Rebbe Rashab was a little boy. And there's a meaning of Achnasa L'Cheder, which is a very holy minig. This is besides for the upshedding, which is also a holy minig. But the Achnasa L'Cheder is you wrap the baby in a talis, and you're very careful that the day you machnas a child L'Cheder, the child should not see a dog. You're supposed to keep the baby in the house. It shouldn't see any treifa animals. It's a minig yisol atik. It's not, before the Rebbe spoke about treifa animals, there was this minig. And you carry the child to the cheder wrapped in a towel, so you shouldn't see anything which is tamei. And in the cheder, they do a ceremony. He reads certain psukim. He does the olive bays, and they put honey on the psukim and honey on the olive bays, and he licks the honey. And then you make an egg. You write the psukim on the egg, which the child eats. And then there's a special cake where you write the psukim, and the child participates in all of these minhagim. It has to do, it's chinuch for limud ateda. It's very sacred minhagim. You can't understand these ideas, but these minhagim are hundreds of years old. They're very holy minhagim, and it's spiritually preparing the child to learn Torah. One of the minhagim of Achnasa L'Cheder is as the child sits on the malamid's lap, and the malamed is reading with him alav beis, and reading him those few psukim. you throw candies on the child. And you tell the child that the candy is born from Malach Machon. The Malach Machon is throwing candies. And the Rebbe once spoke about this, how you are allowed to lie to a child, And the Rebbe explained it's not a lie. The Rebbe gave a whole explanation. It's true. I mean, somebody else's hand is obviously throwing the candles, but the candles are attacking from Malach Machon. The Rebbe Rashab was a very sincere boy. And they told him that the candies of Malach Machon, he wouldn't eat them. So he saved them. But who knew that he saved the candies? Tzemach Tzedek called him the night of Bedikas Chometz. He said, you still have the candies. He said, you got to eat them all up because they're Chometz. Tzemach Tzedek knew his grandson, was a little kid. He knew that the Rebbe Rashab had candies. Mamachol was probably saving them for a special date. So right before Pesach, the Zayda, his birthday is now, Cheshvan. He said, you have candies left over from that? He said, yeah, you got to eat them all up now because you can't sell them. He didn't want to sell the chometz. He said, the mice. It's a little mice with the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab. This is a little bit about the Rebbe Rashab's childhood. In the Tzemach Tzedek's house, there was a cheder just for the Tzemach Tzedek's children. Tzemach Tzedek had a malamed who he hired, who taught his children and his grandchildren, and we assume that the Rebbe Rashab learned by that malamed also, whose name we know from the Rishimis. I don't remember it offhand. The Rebbe Rashab was engaged to be married when he was, I think, 3 or 4 maximum. In the Beis Rivka, they made chasnas very early, but they don't do it. They talk about arranged marriages, not like we have arranged marriages with a bunch of dates. It was talking arranged marriage. Who did he marry? He married a first cousin. His father married a first cousin, and he married a first cousin. And the Tzemach Tzedek married a second cousin. She's a little further away. He married the daughter of Rabbi Yossi Paltiel. The Rebbe was named after his maternal grandfather. He was the Tzemach Tzedek's son. He was the 6th of the 7 boys. But he was born in Tov Pei. That would be 1820. The Rebbe Marash, his brother, after him, was born in Tov Tzadidal, which is 1834. There was 14 years between the 6th brother and the 7th brother. When the Rebbe Marash was born, the Tzemach Tzedek's wife, the Rebbe Achei Temimim, was not ovulating anymore. It was a nest. She was not able to have children. It was a nest that the Tzemach Tzedek was born. So the brothers were 14 years apart. And they made a shidduch, and the Bechayef and Tzemach Tzedek. And they made tnoim. They used to make conditions in those days. And in those days, tnoim was very binding. Today, we're mevatal tnoim. I mean, you guys go to weddings, but you're the women's side. By the Kabbalah's Panim, they read a paper. And then under the chuppah, they read another paper. The chuppah, the paper they read under the chuppah is called the ksuba. It's for the marriage. The paper they read by the Kabbalah's Panim is called tnoim. It's for the engagement. But we read the tnoim when the engagement is over. In the olden days, they used to make the tnoim before. And the problem with that was that people got into trouble, because if you break an engagement, you're breaking the tnoim. You're breaking the tnoim, it costs people money. They had in those tnoim an oath, a shvua, and a klala. They used to, and a curse. They used to say it was better to get married and get divorced than to break an engagement, because the curse of the tnoim was frightening. And at some point, they stopped it. They took it out, because it became not a game. It wasn't a joke. A person breaks a shidduch, he killed people, it's nishka poshtamais. But they had a start noim when they got engaged, when they were children. And in the start noim, it's written how much money the tzaddik chosn is going to give. That means the Rebbe Marash, how much money the tzaddik is going to give. I think it was 1,000 ruble a year for the years that he would sit and learn, but I'm not sure about the numbers, about the years. And at the bottom it says, I will also participate with 500 ruble, Menachem. Tzemach Tzedek. He was the Zayde, he said, I'm also going to be Mishtatev. And they wrote on the Start Noim that the Chasna is going to be in Yerushalayim. And if Chas v'Sholem Mashiach doesn't come, it's going to be in Lubavitch. Or they just wrote Yerushalayim, whatever it was. Lepoil, when they got married, there was a big argument. The Avruch wanted the Chasna by him and Avruch. And the Rebbe Marash said that Tata gives up Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim is Lubavitch. So they said, no, Yerushalayim is Lubavitch, Yerushalayim is Avruch, where I live. It's a story. It's a different. We'll get to it when we get to it. I'm not talking about this now. But he was engaged to be married when his Zayda was still alive, and that was normal. The Beis Rivka, they would get engaged very early. The Rebbe Rashab had an older brother. I'm only telling this to you because I'm not going to have any other time to tell the story. His older brother's name is Razor, Reb Zalman Aaron. Reb Zalman Aaron married also a first cousin. He married Reb Solnech's daughter. Reb Solnech was the 3rd of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. Rabbi Yossi Paltiel was the 6th, the Rebbe Marash was the 7th, Shalnech was the 3rd. He was born when the Alter Rebbe was still alive. His younger brother is Chaim Shnei Zalman, after the Alter Rebbe. So Shalnech was much older than the Rebbe Marash. So they made a shidduch. The Rebbe Marash made a shidduch with his older brother, with Marin. He was probably 20 years older than him. Not 20 years older than him. 15 years older than him for sure. Much older than him. 10, 15, a lot older than him. So the Marin was nervous. The Rebbe Marash was a big tzaddik. It was a big nister. Nobody knew who he was. They were afraid that maybe he's modern, what's going to be. And the Tzemach Tzedek saw Rebbe Shalnech was not so comfortable with the shidduch. He says, "Was has made us that it can and learn at azayfil vidu ken sveter zecher kennen." Tzemach Tzedek told his son, "You're afraid that your chassan is not going to be able to learn. As much as you can learn, he'll for sure be able to learn. He'll know more than you. Don't worry. It's okay. It's beseder." He was a baby, mamish 4 years old. They made Shreit Noim. So the Rebbe Rashab also had a Shreit Noim at a very early age. They were engaged to be married at very early ages. And then many years later, they would get married. Wie verständlich, it wasn't the chassan kal didn't hang out. They didn't go out. They got engaged, and it was time to get married. They got married. Now, the last story about the relationship between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab, it happened Tzemach Tzedek passed away. Because I mentioned to you that they used to go into the Tzemach Tzedek on their birthdays for a bracha and for a coin. At the end of the Tzemach Tzedek's life, he started to invite the grandchildren to come once a week. So most of the grandchildren were probably married with children already, but the Rebbe Rashab and his brother and his sister would go once a week to Zayd and they would give them a coin. In the last week's mamish of the Tzemach Tzedek's life, he changed it to every day. Every day they went into the Zayd for a matbeah. Tzemach Tzedek passed away at Yom Nisan, out of Pesach. So the house was full of people. Tzemach Tzedek was very ill. Everyone was really in a panic. They were very afraid of what was going to happen. And the Rebbe Rashab was waiting for his older brother, the Razah, to come to go in and get the matbeah. And the Razah wasn't coming. He was late. So the Rebbe Rashab finally became impatient. So he went in by himself. The problem was that Rebbe Rashab had a nanny, because the Rebbe Rashab was a rich man, in quotes. He had a ninke, a nanny who was looking at them. She was a woman, and she was probably not Jewish. The problem is, as you know, the halacha, a woman is not allowed to walk between two men, and a man is not allowed to walk between two women. And by the way, just like you're not supposed to walk between two men, you're not supposed to walk between two dogs. That's the din. And two trees, I don't know about that. Maybe palm trees. Two trees, show me the mark of that. You're Marlo. Yeah, you're Marlo. I'm not messing with you. You're Marlo, yeah. Okay, I want to see the market. I want to see the market. You'll come to me in 2 seconds with a source. I want to see the market. So the Rebbe Rashab was 5 years old. He knew the halacha. So the bris was packed, and she's supposed to protect him, yeah? So he put himself between her and the wall. She was against the wall, and he was between her and the chassidim, yeah? This little boy, because if she's going to protect him, she's going to be between him and the chassidim, men on both sides. So he walked with her along the side of the wall till he came to the Tzemach Tzedek's cheder. Then he pushed her, like, you stay here, and he went in alone. Tzemach Tzedek gave him a matbeah, and he left. By the time the older brother came, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic. It was over. It was too late. That night, after the Levaya, the Rebbe Marash was running around. He was very agitated. He was looking for his older son, the Razah. And he said to him, did you go into the Zaydah for a coin today? Did you go into the Zaydah for a coin? He said, I missed it. And the Rebbe Marash got very excited. Wo bist du gewesen? Hat ihm alles abgegeben. Which basically means, I'm not translating it literally, where were you? You missed it. Everything he had, he gave to him. He gave it all to your younger brother. It's finished. It's too late. Over. He gave everything to him, and that's how it played out, Taka. The Rebbe Rashab was the Rebbe. Okay, I will continue the story tomorrow with the seminary, or whatever it is. Tomorrow with the seminary base girls, yeah? I'm going to do it in installments if you want the rest.